Hello, everyone. I'm going to record this lecture on history and cultural overview, continental Africa, and the Americas. I'm going to share the screen here a minute to show you which document will help you during this lecture. This is a handout class outline for the lecture. With a little bit of changes near the end of it when I talk about the Americas. But if you follow along with this outline, you won't have to write down lots of things, but you could, if you want, if you've printed a copy, you can make some notes on the sides. But have this nearby and it will help you see what the kind of the general outline of the lecture, and I think it'll be a good help to you. Okay, let's begin. So this is our topic, History and Culture Overview, Continental Africa and the Americas. And you can see here the relationships geographically to these territories. Even though it's hard to see the scale of the distances, you can see that Europe is actually very close to Africa, and Spain and Portugal are practically touching. There's lots of intercultural exchanges between these areas in the early history of Africa. Also, the Middle East is very close to Africa. And then here you see the Atlantic Ocean is in the middle here. And this will be a big part of our story when we talk about African descendants who live in what we refer to as the Americas. So let's get started. So we're going to start with Africa and think about it in terms of territory, but also with lots of different kinds of topographies, landforms, and obviously diverse peoples as well. These images give us a sense of some of that diversity, but also how large the continent of Africa is. The continental United States could fit within the landmass area of Africa 2 to 3 times. So those of you that have traveled across the United States know how vast our territory is. Imagine how much larger this place is. And so therefore, Africa sometimes gets referred to as a country, but we have to remember in the front of our minds that it's actually a continent with now, in modern times, over 50 countries. These are some images of the diversity of people. We have this is a group from Central Africa referred to as the Maasai. They're a nomadic group of people. North Africans have a diverse spread of cultural groups. We'll talk about North Africa early on in this semester. And also South Africa, here are some children that attend school together, multiple generations. My phone is ringing. Okay, got through that. Sorry about that. Many generations of white Africans are considered to be citizens of the area of South Africa, and that's due to its history too. So hopefully this just dispels the myth that everybody in Africa is Black. Of course, the majority of people are what we would call people of color, but there's various races and ethnicities that make up this continent. It is not all one homogeneous group. We have lots of different kinds of topographies, like in the northern regions of Africa, we have drier areas, desert-like areas. In some of the central plains in West Africa, we have what's called the savanna or grasslands. In the coastal areas, there are lots of very thick, dense forested areas, as well as coastal settlement areas and fishing villages. In one country alone, such as Ghana, they also have mountains, so they could have all of these features in their country. When we get to the eastern edges of Africa, and there's lots of plateaus and cliff-like rock formations, and actually a lot of beautiful waterfalls in a couple key areas, rivers as well in the continent. So lots of water, not just desert in this area. We often we'll talk about Africa in terms of regions. So instead of talking about specific countries, sometimes we can break it down into regions and they might have some similarities in terms of their histories or culture groups. But this is a general way that a lot of the readings might refer to music as well, or art, or whatever they're talking about. Northern Africa is considered these regions. However, some people will include other areas in this category of Northern Africa. Western Africa is considered this kind of bulbous area that sticks out here. Middle Africa or Central Africa, sometimes people define it here, but for this map, it's showing us these countries here. Southern Africa is actually a region, and then the country of South Africa is down here. And what's interesting about South Africa is there's actually a country within a country. So this is another country, and this is another country. Eastern Africa along the edge here. Many cultural and religious influences. This is just a quick slide to give us a quick sampling. We could talk about religion, for example, as a cultural influence. And you should know that the major dominant religions in Africa have historically over time, even early on, have been Islam or Muslims, many Muslims in Africa, but Islamic belief systems, Christianity, and traditional religions. So these are represented by some images here, and I'll go through them. So the traditional religions here have a lot of interaction with nature and ancestors. Perhaps we can have another lesson like this that's recorded on African religions, traditional religions. That will help with some of the understandings of the things that we look at. Islamic faith came through the northern regions of Africa through conquest and later into West Africa um, through trade and intermingling of smaller clerics and commercial enterprises. Christianity was well known on the eastern edges of Africa, especially in the areas of Ethiopia. In fact, some of the first developments of Christian theology and ideas of faith and ways to be a member in that faith were developed in Africa, in the areas of Ethiopia. So there's still a thriving history and thriving contemporary culture of Christianity in some of those regions. Christianity came to Western Africa and the southern eastern regions through the colonial era when Europeans brought missionaries with them, but also in modern day missionaries have had a big influence in Africa. In terms of social structures on the continent, and if we look at a historical viewpoint of this, before there were the nation states that we know today, those boundaries of modern countries, there were basically these larger regions or smaller clusters of villages. And so the larger regions were ruled just like any other empire in the world, in Europe or in Asia or whatever. They were considered kingdoms. And some of them were quite prosperous and very developed. They had militias, they had military, they had systems of judgment like courts for criminality. They had a social hierarchy. Not everybody was the same. They had African elites and then servant classes. So they were socially stratified. Another type of social structure in Africa were what's called decentralized territories. They were like villages that were nearby and clustered together, and they were semi-autonomous, and then they would have a council of elders that would come together at periods of time and decide how to organize themselves and how to rule. So they did have a structure of governing or helping the society um, develop with things that you would see in any society, but they were done in a different way. They were more autonomous. So we have these centralized large kingdoms and then these decentralized areas. And this is kind of how the early development of the African continent went. Today, there are countries that are independent. Some of them are run like autocratic rule. Some of them are run like democracies with varying styles of government. So in the earliest times that we know that we can actually learn something about Africa, we understand that they were interacting with each other and with people all over the world. They weren't just static in their own situations. They actually traveled, they traded, they sometimes traveled at great lengths, but there have always been these interactions. So we need to see the early times of history as an interactive reality, very dynamic, lots of commercial activity, trading goods. And at that time, of course, it would have been bartering, trading services, or the early forms of currency, which would have been shells or small objects made out of gold. But the things were definitely established in terms of their worth and what their perceived worth of things that they were sharing and trading. We have evidence of these archaeological finds have found large-scale trading pathways and routes, including areas that were walled off with stone. So we can go back all the way to 1000 BC, 1300 BC, and way before the Roman Empire, we see that there are these civilizations and early kingdoms. This map here shows some of the trade routes that went from north to south, or north to West Africa and back up through the desert. And there were also what we call transcontinental trade routes that went from west to east and east to west. So long distance trade has always had implications for the development of African music. And here we have some images of instruments that would have been common in Western Africa. And these are some instruments that are common in South Africa. And perhaps those regions would have only had communications and sharing of cultural treasures and cultural ways during certain periods of migration on the continent. But you're going to have a reading assignment with Ruth Stone, and then she tells us that aspects of culture were shared across cultural groups on the continent. So a lot of things that we see today were perhaps not originally from that area of the continent, but they were somehow gained and adopted by other culture groups. So this would have included exposure to instruments, and then they would have adopted other instruments, made instruments similar, and then shared their own. Also sounds, the quality of sounds, and if a group liked the way that music instruments sounded, then they may try to emulate that or copy that. Also characteristics of religious beliefs. Even if they were in this large category of African religions, they would have had commonalities, but also distinct differences and perhaps influences in that way. And religion had a profound impact on early music. From early history on, we know that Africa had highly developed societies and distinct cultural practices. And some of that we know not only through archaeology and finding fragments of instruments, but there's lots of imagery that is quite old. Images that were carved and painted onto rock. Um, or there were tapestries that Europeans had who had traveled to Africa and had seen some of these musical traditions. So these are just some of those kinds of images that we can also use to help reconstruct the history of music in Africa. We know that some of these places had very complex systems of participatory government, like in Egypt, and they established powerful states with wealth and huge influence over many areas of the world on and off the continent. So they also had these international networks, especially those on the edges of Arabia and Europe and such. And of course, they had their own musical traditions, and they had royal music like any other area in Europe or China. Okay, we're moving ahead pretty quickly here in historical time frame. But just to recap, so the Roman Empire was 27 BC to 476 AD, the decided fall of the Roman Empire, and already African civilizations have developed many technologies and many musical traditions. The Middle Ages is known in Europe to be from the years 500 to 1500. And so we're kind of moving to what we saw earlier, and we'll talk about some medieval traditions that still exist in Africa. But now we're moving into what would be considered the end of the Middle Ages and into the early Renaissance period, those of you that have studied European history or music history. This was a time of European exploration and expansion. If you notice here on the map, look how small Western Europe especially was compared to other areas of the world. They had developed technologies in maritime travel, meaning on ships, but also land travel. And so they start to think about you have to think of Western Europe as rivals at times. At times they were peaceful, at times they were competing for power and influence and wealth in that area. And at this time, land could mean increased wealth and an increased political influence. And so they were looking for ways to expand their power and also to gain more wealth. So they set up a rigorous exploration plan. And that's why they refer to this as European exploration and expansion. They did, especially Portugal, had many enterprises where they would stop on the way. Going over to India was a desired area for silk and spices, but they used trading posts along the way to refuel or to rest, to maybe collect whatever, just rest and then continue their pathway. If the weather was bad, the weather pattern, until they could get to where they were really going. The exploration of the Americas came a little bit later, but they were also exploring some regions of Eastern North America, Canada, even way up here in northern regions. And then also, of course, very small to see here, but the Caribbean and South America. At this time, Europe had some presence in Africa, but it was, you can see down here on this map, its presence was small, mostly into the coastal areas. And maybe they set up trading centers. Later on, they would set up forts to protect some of the enterprises that they were doing. We don't get until the early 19th century, the 1800s, do we get a stronger presence of Europe in Africa, but it was still limited to these coastal areas. But this is definitely the time of the transatlantic slave trade, which we will talk about um, later. But right now we're just focusing on African history, even though the transatlantic slave trade had a tremendous impact on Africa, primarily by diminishing their populations and disturbing their social structures. But let's move ahead into some major points of African history afterwards during the 1800s and into the early 1900s. So this is getting closer to contemporary Africa now. Um, Shortly after World War I, there was an idea amongst some European representatives and leaders to think about what might be available in Africa, and it appeared to them that it might be an area where they could explore more, perhaps even occupy and hold down colonies there. And colonies basically is an offshore area that in which the home country or the host country occupies and dominates. So they had this event called the Berlin Conference, in which they looked at a map of Africa, and representatives from England, Holland, France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Spain, many areas of Western Europe were interested in seeing what they could gain from the continent of Africa, and set up this plan to divide up the continent and assign various regions where Europeans could try to hold a governing body there and control the area and mine it for its resources and labor in that way. Um, it is kind of an interesting move in European history, the audacity to think that they could do this, but they actually did. Um, you can see here by the map the colors in which certain areas were dominated by certain European nations. And you should know that some of these situations and circumstances changed. Sometimes Great Britain could push other European powers out and grab more land. But that's a whole class could be taught on the colonization of Africa and then the breaking away from that. You should just know that today some of these countries speak their colonial languages as well as their traditional African languages. There were two areas in Africa that were not successfully occupied by Europe for a period of time, and that was Ethiopia. They remained independent. They could, Italy tried to occupy this area, and through um, armies, local armies were able to drive the Europeans out, and it was never ever successfully colonized. And then another area is Liberia, which was an area that was set up by the United States. In a way, it was colonized by the US instead. And this was an area where African slaves, after they were free, were encouraged to, if anybody wanted to return to Africa, that this is the area where they could go. And again, it's a real kind of awkward part of the story because there were indigenous Africans who lived there, and then many African Americans, or we should say former slaves or freed slaves who went back there, were not from those ethnic groups. And so there were tensions for years between the newly immigrated African descendants and then the indigenous populations there. This is a picture of Queen Elizabeth and an army in Nigeria. In the mid 1900s, African territories started to gain their independence gradually, starting in the late 50s, early 1960s. The first area or territory to gain their independence from European rule was Ghana in 1961, and that was done in a peaceful way through legislative processes. Well, I should say eventually it was peaceful. This is their first This was the first country to gain their independence with a democratically elected president. That man, Kwame Nkrumah, was part of a kind of a hybrid legislature with Europeans and African representatives. He was educated in the US and then went back, and the idea was that he would be an Englishman, a local African who could help England control the region, but it backfired on the British, and he ended up becoming more of an activist for independence, indigenous rule. And then other countries followed suit through time. Some of the later countries were like South Africa that gained their independence later. But it went from about the 1960s until about the 1970s and 80s, okay, before they gained complete self-rule. It's very important when we look at music. We'll have a couple case studies of how European influence has made African music sound certain ways. In terms of its people, Africa holds a great diversity of people, many ethnic groups, and they really define a lot of culture and music traditions, even to this day. An ethnic group, as you have learned from some of the previous lessons, are based in language and cultural, distinct cultural things. You should know that some countries could have multiple ethnic groups. And then sometimes this becomes an issue when young people get married, is if they're marrying somebody from their parents' ethnic group. But of course, there are inter-ethnic marriages as well throughout time. But sometimes this becomes an important issue more than race, of course. Languages, huge diversity. We know today, we can guess that there are probably over anywhere from 1,200 to 2,000 distinct languages on the continent that are spoken, native languages. There are about 7 to 8 major language families that are large categories that have subset dialects that comprise all these languages. There are also language isolates that have developed on their own. There are also what we call Creole languages or hybrid languages that are a mixture from a couple different languages. So tremendous linguistic diversity on the continent. And this becomes very challenging if you're studying music in Africa, because if you're wanting to learn songs, it's helpful to have a competency in one of those languages. They also, many of these regions of Africa speak European languages. So there are some countries, for example, that speak predominantly English. If they've went to school, they know English pretty well, French, Portuguese, things like this. They may also speak, it's very common for people at the college age to speak multiple languages, two or three. It's very common because of this needing to interact with people in so many different ways. You might know your tribal language, you might know another trade language, you might know the colonial language if you went to school, and then the language, whatever is spoken in your religious background, like Arabic. So it just depends. There is many religions in Africa today, not just the big three that I spoke of earlier, but there's Buddhism. South Africa has a tremendous religious diversity. There are Christian faiths that are influenced by Baptist Church from the US, Methodists, all those denominations that we have here. Many religious affiliations that people could have. And so musical performance can be seen in Africa in every human activity in Africa, to building a bridge, to baptizing a child, to celebrating a birthday, kind of similar to what we might see here, to the installation of a new leader. There are traditions, music, very old traditions, as well as popular music that might be used at a political campaign. So, as well as dances. These are some images here of a harvest festival. They make a big deal out of the harvest. These are yams that it's kind of a staple in many parts of Africa. This is royal music, an example, and this is also royal music. You can see these are two different areas of Africa. This is in Ghana, and this is in East Africa, I believe. Yes, because of the drums. These are Ugandan drums. This is singing at a funeral. And lots of times the traditions are to stand in a circle and participatory singing, not just a soloist. And then here's just an image of a neo-traditional development in music, combining traditional African vocal music traditions with Christian vocal music traditions, like choral harmonies and gospel music as well. So and this is from East Africa and Kenya. Okay, let's shift now to the relationship between Africa and the Americas. I really like this image, and to give credit is here for this image. I did not create that. It's nice for us to look at. Also to think about that Africa not only influenced the Americas in a tremendous way in our music and in our cultures, but also vice versa. Okay, so we're going back in time again. So we need to think about the Americas as also having empires, just like Africa at the time, way before the Spanish exploration and Christopher Columbus. There were powerful empires all over the Americas. Here we have the Aztec Empire. If you know anything about the history of Mexico, or if you've traveled there, you can find pyramids in this area. It's a very fascinating history of the Aztec people. There's another very important early empire in the Americas would have been the Inca Empire, and that is in what's present-day Peru. And these would have been indigenous groups that had developed societies there. And also, we had some of those in Arizona and Mexico, I mean, in Texas as well. But then, of course, during various times, they migrated southward into Mexico. Africa had, as you remember, had their own empire. So these are all going on simultaneously. China, India, all over the world. These were ways that people organized their societies. Sometimes, some of them, many of them before the empires in Europe, but sometimes simultaneously as well. European empires were small in terms of physical territory, but because of the technologies that they developed for exploration, world exploration, particularly maritime exploration, they ended up having a lot of power and control for many centuries. If you like world history, it's interesting to think about how much territory, even though Western Europe was so small, and how much area they had their hand in. And those would have been monarchies at the time, kingdoms and queens ruling those empires. So the biggest changes happened, of course, to the Americas happened during the transatlantic slave trade, initiated by Western Europe, and bringing things to exploring the Americas. So they were exploring the coastal areas of West and Central Africa and South Africa, but their interests were trading in territories in Asia, starting with the Portuguese. The Portuguese were some of the earliest participants in exploring the Americas and bringing slaves eventually to these areas. And they were the leaders, the true leaders of ship design, nautical instruments for navigating where they were in the ocean, and designing maps. So they were very advanced with these technologies and skills, and that was considered very valuable to the kings at the time. So a lot of times we hear about the conquistadors or the explorers. They had these kinds of ambitions to help their king or queen explore these areas and establish control in these areas. So the first selling of slaves was small scale. And sometimes Africans were actually brought, let's use North America as an example. Sometimes Africans were brought there, but they were basically free. They were part of the ship crew. They could have had other jobs to help kind of survey the land and or develop the land. And they might have even been seen like employees and not necessarily like slaves for life. But there are the development and different, that was based on the laws in North America that started to determine that these people would be considered laborers, but that happened a little bit later, like in the 1700s. So some of the first evidence we have of Africans being brought to North America might have been in the 1500s and 1600s, but those populations were very tiny. However, Brazil was the one to receive the majority of slaves early on. Another factor to the Atlantic slave trade was not just economic, but it also was a concern about the spread of Islam and Christianity, because if you remember, Western Europe was very small, and large swaths of Northern Africa were starting to become occupied by Islamic faith. And you have to remember there were lots of conflicts between Christian and Islamic societies at that time. And so the Christian agenda was also part of this slave trade idea, partly to convert, bringing Africans to areas where they could convert them to Christianity. But also the early settlers of the Americas were not as familiar with Africans and their structures of society, and even the accomplishments that Africans had had. They were less educated or less experienced about the societies in Africa. And so many times they perceive these Africans as kind of primitive, uneducated, and needing to be saved. So there was some distortions about their perspectives of both indigenous people and Africans. And we could talk a little bit about how Europeans were interested in first cultivating indigenous groups, the native people of those areas, to do the labor, but that project did not work out very well. They resisted in a different way, and they also obtained many diseases that they did not have immunities to, and so many native people died when they came in contact with the Europeans. So the whole idea of perhaps Africans coming over as laborers became more of a possibility. And it also, on the continent of Africa, there were rival groups, competing groups, and they were capturing other Africans, and then they were selling those as part of the goods that they were exchanging. Okay, so this whole story of how Africans were participating in the slave trade is complicated. You also need to know that Africans did not see lifetime slavery. They did not have that on their continent. They had servants who maybe had a period of 7 years and then they could work their way out of that role in society, especially as they grew older. But this whole notion of being a slave for life was new, and it was established by European settlers in the Americas. So one of the big things that drove the slave trade and the demand for more and more slaves over time was the ability to grow sugar cane. And they did some of that off the shores of Africa on some islands, but they also did this in the Americas. The land was so fertile for that. And Europeans really grew to love sugar. There are books written about the history of sugar if you have, it's a fascinating history if you have an interest in this. So we need to talk about this term, the Americas, and what do we mean by that, and also to think about where slaves were brought. So these are the general areas that include, for our discussions in our class, we're looking at African descendants of the slave trade. And so we could look at music anywhere in these places. And we were thinking about music made by African descendants, developed by African descendants, and how that influenced these societies. North America, including Canada, Mexico. A lot of people don't realize that slaves were brought to Canada and Mexico, let alone other areas other than the United States. And in fact, the slaves that were brought to United States, the numbers, in terms of the numbers, were much smaller than other areas, especially the Caribbean islands and Brazil, South America. But Peru, Chile, Venezuela, and Trinidad, any of those areas had slaves. Okay, this gives us an idea a little bit about how many slaves were brought based on what historians have been able to determine. But over 10 million people were taken. That's more than our population in our country today. So it's staggering, and it's hard to make that reality vivid. And it was done, over about 2 or 3 centuries. Okay, so this is just an interesting map. We can see what kinds of agricultural products at that time that money was in agriculture: tobacco, coffee, cotton, sugar, mining, and rice. So mining meant gold. There was a lot of gold in Brazil, actually, and silver in Peru. That became more the dominant. There was cattle ranching in the Caribbean, Dominican Republic. Haiti had sugar, Brazil had sugar, and of course the US had sugar, and then cotton was actually a later development in terms of the labor. So all these things affected music making, believe it or not. So for us in this class, this just gives us a little bit of a historical and cultural overview. We're going to be studying specific case studies that align with the themes, and therefore you could transfer any of the themes into any areas of the world, but we're going to use certain case studies to understand things that intersect with music making. And these are just some images for us to think about in terms of group singing. This image here is an Afro-Brazilian religion, but you can certainly identify that those instruments are of African origin, as well as some of the ritual uses of music for the religion. We have lots of early drawings in the Americas of music in the Caribbean and in Brazil that had these festivals that resembled, even in the United States in Louisiana, that resembled processional traditions in Africa, just that some of the instruments might have been European instruments and some of them were African. We see a lot of African religious rites in all over the Americas, and even the whole notion of group dancing. This is a picture of a wedding at the African American community, and dancing the electric slide, which is a dance that if people learn it and know it, it's a way of being together and moving together, not just couple dancing. If you're interested in the history of slavery, this is an interesting thing you can explore later. It's an animated timeline, and you can see how the early periods of slavery where slaves went, and then also the years and time that it intensified. And it's really fascinating. It's about 2 minutes long, and you can just kind of see where they have these animations of density of people. Also, this is a great mini series curated by Henry Louis Gates. Some of you watch the Finding Your Roots on television. He's the man that runs that program, but he did this documentary about the African American experience all the way up to the inauguration of Barack Obama, just looking at things that have happened in the African American experience. So I recommend, if you want something to do during Black History Month, this or any other time, actually, you could watch this. Okay, that's all I have. I hope you gained a little bit of the historical timeline, and hopefully this will help you with future learning and assignments.